Ethan Caldwell walked out of that Manhattan courthouse with Vanessa Blake on his arm and a smile on his face that had no business being there. Not on a man who had just signed the end of a 7-year marriage. He turned to Natalie, her divorce papers still warm from the clerk's desk, and said it like he'd been saving it for exactly this moment. "You think this is over? Baby, this is where it starts. Your father's company? It's already mine, has been for months." He straightened his jacket, kissed Vanessa on the cheek while Natalie was still standing there, and walked away like he owned the sidewalk. He thought he'd already won. He had no idea he'd just made the worst miscalculation of his life. If this story is already hitting different, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss what comes next. We tell the stories that make your jaw drop and your heart race, and trust me, this one is far from over. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning had started the way most terrible mornings do, quietly. Natalie Whitmore had been awake since 4:30, sitting at the small kitchen table in her friend Patricia's spare bedroom, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and staring at nothing in particular. The apartment smelled like someone else's laundry detergent. The mattress in the spare room had a spring that dug into her lower back. She hadn't unpacked more than 2 days' worth of clothes because some part of her brain, the stubborn, refusing to accept it part, had kept insisting this wasn't permanent. But that morning she'd woken up and known. She'd known it the way you sometimes know things, in that half-conscious space before you're fully awake. Not with your rational mind, but with something older and quieter. Today was the day she was going to sign the papers and walk out of that courthouse as a single woman. And whatever life she'd been building for the last 7 years was going to be officially, legally over. She'd showered, dried her hair without really thinking about it, and put on the black blazer she always wore when she needed to feel like a person with her life together. Then she'd stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a long time without being entirely sure what she was looking for. The cab to the courthouse had been stuck in traffic for 20 minutes on 6th Avenue. She'd watched a woman with a stroller navigate a broken sidewalk panel and felt an absurd surge of emotion about it. By the time she walked into the building, she'd talked herself into a kind of functional numbness. She was going to get through this, sign what needed signing, keep her face neutral, not give Ethan the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. What she hadn't counted on was Vanessa. Natalie spotted her the moment she stepped off the elevator. Vanessa Blake, standing in the hallway outside the courtroom like she belonged there, wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly car payment used to be. She was checking her phone, one hand resting lightly on the wall, and she looked up when she heard Natalie's heels on the marble floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vanessa smiled. Not a mean smile, not exactly, but one of those careful smiles that managed to convey an enormous amount without technically doing anything wrong. The kind of smile that says, "I'm here, and you know exactly why I'm here, and there's nothing you can do about it." "Natalie," she said. "Vanessa." Natalie kept walking. The proceedings themselves were mercifully brief. Their lawyers did most of the talking. Ethan sat across the conference table looking like a man at a routine business meeting. Relaxed, unhurried, occasionally tapping something into his phone under the table as if his attention were divided between this and something more interesting happening elsewhere. He'd barely looked at Natalie, which had somehow been worse than if he'd stared at her. She signed where she was told to sign, initialed what needed to be initialed, listened while the language of their marriage was translated into asset divisions and settlement terms and the cold arithmetic of what 7 years apparently amounted to. And then it was done. They'd walked out into the hallway together by default. Same elevator, same exit. Natalie was already planning the route to the cab stand when Ethan fell into step beside her, closer than he needed to be, and Vanessa materialized from somewhere to his left. That's when he said it. "You think this is over? Baby, this is where it starts." She'd stopped walking. She couldn't help it. The word baby hit her like a flat hand against the chest, not because it was tender, but because it was deliberate. It was the word he'd used throughout their entire marriage whenever he wanted to sound more casual than he was, whenever he wanted to make something feel smaller than it was. "Baby, you're overreacting. Baby, you're reading too much into things. Baby, you always do this." He kept talking. "Your father's company. You think the Whitmore Group is still yours?" He tilted his head slightly, like he was explaining something to someone who should have already figured it out. I've had people inside that company for 3 years, Natalie. 3 years. Payroll, operations, vendor contracts, building management. By the time you get back to your father and explain what just happened here today, there won't be anything left to protect. She'd looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in a long time, and understood something that she should have understood much earlier. The marriage hadn't been a mistake he made. It had been a strategy he'd run. Vanessa touched his arm with exactly the kind of casual familiarity that's designed to be witnessed, and Ethan smiled, and they walked to the elevator together. Natalie stood in the courthouse hallway for 60 seconds, maybe 90, just breathing. Then she took out her phone and called her father. Charles Whitmore answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting her. "How'd it go?" he asked. His voice had that particular texture it got when he was trying to sound steady. A little too even, a little too measured. "It's done," Natalie said. She was already outside, standing on the courthouse steps, squinting into the October light. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "Okay." "How many people connected to Ethan are currently working at the company?" A beat. "Natalie, Dad." Another beat, longer this time. "More than I want to admit," Charles said quietly. She closed her eyes. "I need you to remove every single one of them, today. Call Rachel, call legal, do whatever you need to do, but I need them gone before end of business." Her father exhaled. Not quite a sigh, something more complicated than that. "That's not going to be simple. Some of these people, they're embedded pretty deep. HR, the hotel division, the property management side. I understand that. It's going to create a disruption." "Dad." She opened her eyes. Across the street, a delivery truck was blocking traffic and someone was leaning on their horn. The ordinary world, going about its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the fact that everything she thought she knew had just rearranged itself. "Remove everyone connected to Ethan today. I'll explain the rest when I get there." Charles was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been expecting this call for about 2 years," which was the part that hit hardest. Not Ethan's smug exit, not Vanessa's smile, not even the discovery of what had been happening inside the company. It was her father's voice saying he'd been expecting it, the quiet, sorry weight of that sentence, that finally cracked something open in Natalie's chest as she stood on those courthouse steps. She held it together because she'd promised herself she would, but it cost her. She went to her mother's old apartment first. She wasn't entirely sure why. It wasn't the practical choice. Her next move should have been straight to the Whitmore Group offices on Lexington Avenue, or at minimum back to Patricia's to change out of this blazer and collect her thoughts. But her feet took her to the Upper West Side, to the building on Riverside Drive where her mother had lived for the last 12 years of her life. The apartment that had technically been Natalie's since the estate settled, but that she'd never been able to bring herself to either move into or sell. The key still worked. The apartment smelled like closed rooms and old paper and faintly something floral that Natalie couldn't identify. Her mother's perfume, maybe, or just the ghost of it embedded in the upholstery. She sat down on the floor in the middle of the living room. Just sat there for a while. Then she got up and started opening drawers. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. Something concrete. Something she could hold in her hands that would help her understand the shape of what she was dealing with. She found it in the hall closet, in a cardboard box behind a set of winter coats that hadn't moved in years. Her mother had been meticulous. Margaret Whitmore had kept records the way some people keep diaries, not because she was required to, but because she found comfort in documentation, in the sense that if something was written down, it couldn't be completely denied. The box contained years of the Whitmore Group's financial records, old quarterly reports, internal memos, some of it going back 15 years. Natalie sat on the closet floor with the box between her knees and started reading. It took her about 40 minutes to find the first anomaly. A vendor listed in the maintenance contracts for their flagship hotel on Park Avenue, a company called Meridian Building Services that she had never heard of. The payments were consistent, every quarter, reliable as a utility bill, going back 4 years. She photographed the page with her phone and kept reading. 40 more minutes, and she found a second company she didn't recognize in the payroll records. A consulting firm, something called Delta Advisory Group, receiving significant monthly payments with no corresponding deliverables listed anywhere she could find. And then, slowly, with the particular sick feeling of someone who already knows what they're going to find before they find it, she started cross-referencing the names. Meridian Building Services. She pulled up a business search on her phone. Registered owner, Christopher Caldwell, Ethan's cousin. She sat with that for a moment. Delta Advisory Group. Registered owner, Thomas Caldwell, Ethan's uncle. She photographed everything she could reach, stacked the most critical documents in a separate pile, and sat with her back against the closet wall, looking at her phone. 4 years. They had been pulling money out of her family's company for 4 years, while she was married to Ethan, while she was thanking him for introducing her to his family, while she was genuinely trying to make everyone feel included. She thought about the cousin, Marcus, she thought his name was Marcus, who had come to her one Sunday afternoon 2 years into the marriage, uncomfortable and a little apologetic seeming, asking if there might be anything available at the company. "Nothing fancy, Natalie. I just need something to get back on my feet." She'd thought that was kind. She'd thought it meant Ethan was humble enough to let his family ask her for things instead of demanding them. She thought about Ethan's Aunt Brenda, who had spent about 6 months helping with administrative work at the hotel. Natalie had liked her, or at least she'd liked the version of Brenda that Brenda had presented to her. She thought about all the meetings she'd sat through, all the introductions, all the family dinners where she'd worked hard to make everyone feel welcome. And she understood now that she'd been looking at a map without being able to read it. Every connection, every favor, every, of course, family should be taken care of, had been a thread in something she hadn't been able to see while she was still inside it. She called Rachel Morgan from the cab on the way to the office. Rachel was the Whitmore Group's corporate attorney, and she picked up sounding like she'd been waiting for the call, which maybe she had. "I need you at the office," Natalie said, "and I need you to bring whoever handles forensic accounting." "Daniel Brooks?" Rachel said immediately. "He's good. Do you want me to call him, or—" "Please, today if possible." "Can you give me a sense of what we're looking at?" Natalie looked out the cab window at the east side traffic. "Vendor fraud, payroll manipulation, possibly more. I have documentation, but I need someone who can read it properly." A pause. "Natalie, is this about Ethan's family?" She hadn't expected the directness. "Yes." "Okay." Rachel's voice shifted into a different register. Still calm, but sharper, more precise. The voice she probably used when she was in a room full of people who were not on her side. "I'll have Daniel there by 4. Don't touch anything on the company servers until I get there." "Understood." "And Natalie?" "Yeah. I'm glad you called." "What?" The Whitmore Group occupied 4 floors of a Lexington Avenue building that Natalie's grandfather had purchased in the late 1980s. The lobby had the slightly worn grandeur of old money, dark wood paneling, brass fixtures, carpeting that had probably been expensive when it was installed and was now just old. She walked in just after 2 o'clock and was immediately aware of being watched. Not in a paranoid way. Not exactly. But she'd grown up coming to this building, had worked here in various capacities since her mid-20s, knew most of the faces in these halls, and something felt subtly off. The way a familiar room feels wrong when something in it has been moved without your knowledge. She found her father in his office on the 3rd floor. Charles Whitmore was 71 years old, built like a man who had once been much bigger, and was now carrying the careful posture of someone managing the space his body took up. He'd been running the Whitmore Group for 30 years and had the kind of face that looked calm even when it wasn't. He stood up when she came in, which wasn't something he always did. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Tell me what you know," he said. So she told him. She laid the photographs out on his desk, the vendor contracts, the payroll records, the business registrations she'd pulled on her phone in the cab. Charles sat behind his desk and looked at each one without speaking. His face didn't change much, but his jaw worked in a way she recognized from childhood, the thing he did when he was holding back something he didn't want to say in front of someone. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "How much did you know?" she asked. He looked up. "Not all of this, but I knew something was wrong with the maintenance contracts. Oh, about 18 months ago. I raised it with our finance director and was told the discrepancy had been reviewed and cleared." "Who was the finance director at the time?" Charles's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Alan Gorman. He left the company 8 months ago, voluntarily," he said. "Was he connected to Ethan?" Another silence. "His wife went to school with Ethan's sister," Charles said. Natalie sat down heavily in the chair across from her father's desk. They looked at each other across 30 years of father-daughter history, and the particular weight of something that had been avoided for too long and had finally arrived anyway. "I should have moved faster," Charles said. "When I started seeing the edges of it, I thought—" He stopped, started again. "You were married to him, Natalie. I thought if I started pulling threads, it would hurt you. It hurt me more not knowing. I understand that now." She picked up one of the photographs from his desk. The Meridian Building Services contract, Christopher Caldwell's name in the business registration. "We can fix this," she said. "Rachel's coming with a forensic accountant. We're going to go through everything." Charles nodded. "I already called HR. They're pulling personnel files on everyone who came in through referrals in the last 4 years. And the vendors? I flagged 6 contracts for immediate review. We're not processing any outstanding payments until Rachel signs off." Natalie exhaled for what felt like the first time since the courthouse steps. "He thought we'd be too busy grieving to notice," she said. Charles looked at her. His expression was complicated, tired, and something she could only identify as pride, though it sat strangely under the circumstances. "He miscalculated," he said. She picked up her phone and sent Rachel a message. "We'll be ready when you get here." Outside the window, the city was doing its ordinary afternoon business. Horns and sirens, and the indifferent roar of 10 million people living their lives. In here, something was beginning that wouldn't be easy or quick or clean. But it was beginning, and for the first time since 4:30 that morning, Natalie felt something that was not quite hope, but was moving in that direction. The specific, quiet resolve of a person who has stopped waiting to understand what happened and started figuring out what to do about it. Rachel Morgan arrived at 10 minutes past 4, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived several wars and a large coffee she hadn't touched yet. Daniel Brooks came in behind her, younger than Natalie had expected, maybe mid-30s, with the particular kind of quiet intensity that people develop when their job requires them to find things other people have worked very hard to hide. He was carrying a laptop bag and a legal pad already covered in handwritten notes, which told her he'd been thinking about this since Rachel called him. They set up in the conference room on the 3rd floor, the one with the long mahogany table that Charles used for board meetings. Natalie spread out her photographs and documents on one end. Daniel opened his laptop and connected to the company's financial server with a guest credential Rachel had arranged in advance. Charles sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing, which was its own kind of communication. "Walk me through what you found," Daniel said, not looking up from his screen. He had a notepad beside the keyboard and a pen in his hand, and the slightly distracted energy of someone whose brain was already running 3 levels ahead of the conversation. Natalie walked him through it. The Meridian Building Services contract, the Delta Advisory Group payments, the business registrations she'd found on her phone. The timeline, 4 years at minimum, possibly longer, if some of the older records showed what she suspected they showed. Daniel listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Most people, when you explained something complicated to them, couldn't resist the urge to demonstrate that they were following along. Daniel just absorbed it, made notes, asked 2 specific questions about account numbers, and then turned back to his screen. Rachel, meanwhile, had pulled out her own laptop and was reviewing the personnel files that HR had sent over. She had a yellow legal pad next to her keyboard and was writing names in a column, occasionally circling something or drawing a line connecting 2 entries. They worked like that for almost an hour before anyone spoke at length. "Okay," Daniel said finally, sitting back. He rubbed the side of his face with the hand that wasn't holding his pen. "So the Meridian payments alone, we're looking at just over $2.3 million over 4 years. That's not counting the Delta Advisory invoices, which I'm still pulling, but from what I can see in Q2 and Q3 of the last fiscal year, we're talking another $800,000 minimum." Charles, who had been sitting with his hands folded on the table, shifted his weight. What were the stated services for Meridian? Building maintenance and repair at the Park Avenue property, routine inspections, HVAC work, some structural assessments. Daniel turned his laptop so the table could see the screen. "But when I cross-reference the invoices with the actual maintenance logs from your facilities team, the overlap is around 30%, meaning roughly 70% of what Meridian billed for. Either the work was done by someone else, or it wasn't done at all." Nobody said anything for a moment. Rachel looked up from her legal pad. "I have 14 names flagged from the personnel files. People who came in through direct referrals from Ethan or his family, or whose hire dates correspond to points where we know Ethan was communicating with senior staff. She paused. 3 of them are in finance. One is a senior coordinator in property management who has authorization access to vendor contracts. Who approved the Meridian contract originally? Natalie asked. Rachel checked her notes. Paul Stearns, former VP of operations. He retired 14 months ago. Natural retirement? Rachel looked at her over the laptop screen. His pension was significantly enhanced beyond standard terms. It's in the benefits records. Natalie felt a coldness settle in somewhere around her sternum. Not anger, exactly. Something more methodical than anger. Anger was hot, and it made you want to move fast. What she was feeling was the opposite, a deliberate, careful chill that made her want to slow down and look at everything twice before touching it. So they built an infrastructure, she said, over years. People in the right positions, vendors getting paid, someone managing the paperwork. It wasn't improvised. Daniel shook his head. No, this took planning. Whoever set this up understood the company well enough to know which positions mattered, which approval processes to route things through, how to keep the numbers from standing out in any individual quarter. He looked at her. They had inside knowledge, real inside knowledge. Charles looked at his daughter. He didn't say anything, but the look said it for him. Ethan had spent 7 years inside their family, 7 years of Sunday dinners and board retreats and casual conversations about the business. 7 years of being trusted, because why wouldn't he be trusted? He was family, wasn't he? Or close enough. We need to freeze the vendor payments immediately, Rachel said. Everything that hasn't already processed this month. And I want the authorization codes for external transfers changed before close of business today. She looked at Charles. Who's your current head of finance? Sandra Okafor. She came up through the company. She's been with us since before any of this started. Good. I need to talk to her directly. Rachel was already writing. I also want to pull the email archives for the last 4 years across every account that had authorization access to Meridian and Delta payments. If there's a paper trail, I want it before anyone on the other side realizes we're looking. Is that going to hold up? Natalie asked. The emails are company property generated on company servers. Yes. Rachel's voice had that flat certainty that good attorneys use when they want to close a door on further discussion. Daniel, can you flag every transaction over $50,000 that went to either entity and generate a report? Give me 90 minutes. You've got 60. Daniel almost smiled. Give me 75. It was the first thing that had felt even remotely normal in the last 12 hours. And Natalie noticed that she was grateful for it in a way she wouldn't have predicted. The almost smile, the small negotiation over time, the ordinary texture of people working a problem together. She got up and walked to the window. The city had shifted into its late afternoon light, that particular amber gray that Manhattan got in October when the sun was at a low angle and the shadows between buildings ran long and sharp. She watched a cab navigate a delivery truck on Lexington and felt the distance between that ordinary street and this room like a physical thing. She was thinking about Helen. Helen Carter had worked at the Whitmore Group's flagship hotel on Park Avenue for 23 years. She was the kind of employee who knew where everything was kept, who to call when something went wrong, and which problems could be handled quietly and which ones needed to go upstairs. She had been Natalie's mother's personal recommendation to the hotel's management team back when Helen was 32 and the Whitmore Park was going through a rough transition. Natalie had known her since she was a teenager. She texted Helen from the conference room window. "Are you at the hotel today?" The response came in under 2 minutes. "Yes, third floor office. Do you need me? Stay there. I'm coming over." She told Rachel and Daniel she'd be back in an hour and took a cab to the hotel. The Whitmore Park occupied a handsome building on Park Avenue that had been renovated 3 times since Natalie's grandfather bought it and still managed to maintain the bones of something that had been built to last. The lobby had high ceilings and a marble floor and the kind of quiet that expensive hotels work hard to achieve. Not silence exactly, but a managed hush that muffled the ordinary sounds of people moving through a space. Helen was in the third floor administrative office, which was small and cluttered and had a view of the air shaft. She stood up when Natalie came in and hugged her. Not the careful professional hug of a work acquaintance, but a real one, the kind that compresses your shoulders. "Sit down," Helen said. "I'll get us some water." She poured 2 glasses from a pitcher on the filing cabinet and sat across from Natalie at the desk. "How are you doing?" Helen asked. I've been better, Natalie said. Helen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if you think the answer is going to upset me. Helen set down her water glass. Her face settled into an expression that wasn't quite resignation, but was close to it. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular conversation to happen and has made their peace with its arrival. What do you know about what's been happening here? Natalie said. The staffing, the vendors, the contracts? Helen was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, which were folded on the desk in front of her. I know things that I didn't report, she said. And I've been sitting with that, Natalie, for a long time. Tell me. Helen reached behind her into the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and withdrew a notebook. Not a company ledger, but a personal one, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore. The cover was worn at the corners, and the pages were dense with handwriting. I kept my own records, Helen said. She slid it across the desk. Because I was watching things that didn't make sense, and nobody upstairs was asking questions, and I didn't know who to trust. Natalie opened the notebook. The handwriting was small and precise, organized by date. It went back almost 3 years. Helen had been logging names, hours, discrepancies. Employees who appeared on the schedule but didn't show up to shifts, or who showed up briefly and left, their hours recorded as full days. She'd noted the names of several workers who came in through the newer management's referrals and who seemed to have no particular function that Helen could identify, no department that claimed them, no supervisor who appeared to be tracking their output. But the page that stopped Natalie cold was about 8 months in. Helen had written overheard conversation between VM and new facilities coordinator, Kay Caldwell, regarding adjusted hours for 3 housekeeping staff. Full days logged, actual hours approximately half. VM said, Charles doesn't look at this level. Keep it consistent and it won't flag. VM, Natalie said. Who is that? Victor Marsh. He came in about 3.5 years ago. His title was Guest Services Director, but he spent most of his time in administration. Helen paused. His wife is Ethan's cousin. Natalie turned the page. More notes, more names. A list of cleaning staff who Helen had spoken with directly. Women who had been employed at the hotel for years, reliable workers, who had noticed their paychecks shrinking. One of them had gone to HR and been told the hours were correct per the records. She'd accepted it because she needed the job and didn't know what else to do. Another entry noted a vendor, not Meridian, a different one, a linen supply company, with a contact name that matched a Caldwell family connection Natalie recognized. How many people are we talking about? Natalie asked. The housekeeping staff whose hours were manipulated. In this building alone, I counted 11. There may be more across the other properties. 11 women. Natalie knew the majority of the housekeeping staff here were women, who had worked their full days, folded their towels, and changed their linens, and cleaned their rooms, and been paid for something less than what they'd given, while someone in administration logged their real hours elsewhere and pocketed the difference. The specific wrongness of that was different from the vendor fraud. The vendor fraud was corporate, abstracted, impersonal, numbers moving between accounts. This was someone reaching directly into the pockets of people who could not afford to lose what was taken from them. Helen, Natalie said. She heard something in her own voice that she didn't entirely recognize. Not quite anger, still that same cold, methodical thing, but underneath it something harder. I need this notebook, and I need you to be willing to talk to our attorney. Yes, Helen said. No hesitation. I've been ready. I just didn't know who to call. You should have called me. You were married to him. Natalie looked at her across the desk. I know, Helen said, more gently. I know you didn't know. That's not what I meant. I didn't want to be the one to put that in front of you. There was a kindness in that, even if it had complicated things. Natalie understood it and couldn't quite argue with it. Call Rachel Morgan's office tomorrow morning, Natalie said, writing the number on the back of one of Helen's notepad pages. Tell her I sent you and that you have documentation. She'll handle the rest. Helen nodded. She walked Natalie to the elevator and stood in the hallway looking at her with an expression that was hard to read, something that had relief in it, and something that looked a little like grief. Your mother would have caught this faster, Helen said. Probably, Natalie said, but she's not here. The elevator doors opened and she stepped in. She got back to the Lexington Avenue office just before 6. Daniel had his report. It was thorough and it was bad. Not catastrophically, not the kind of thing that threatened the company's survival, but bad enough. The total of what could be confirmed at this stage, pending a more complete audit, was somewhere in the range of $3.8 million over 4 years. Vendor payments for work not performed, inflated invoices, payroll manipulation across at least 2 properties. There were also 2 transfers that Daniel couldn't trace cleanly, money that had moved through a routing pattern he described as deliberately layered, which meant someone had known what they were doing when they set it up. "Can we recover it?" Natalie asked. "Some of it," Daniel said. "Depends on how cooperative the banks are and whether the accounts are still active. The vendor stuff is more recoverable than the payroll manipulation. That money's been spent, most likely." "What do we need to do to freeze what's left?" Rachel answered. "I'm filing for a temporary restraining order on the vendor accounts first thing tomorrow morning. It won't get everything, but it'll stop any additional outflow while we build the full picture." She paused. "Natalie, I also need to talk to you about the property holdings." Something in Rachel's voice made Natalie's attention sharpen. "What about them?" Rachel turned her laptop so Natalie could see the screen. It showed a deed record from the city's property database. "Your mother's property on Riverside Drive," Rachel said. "The apartment. What about it?" "Someone filed a request to transfer the deed authorization 2 months ago. It's not a completed transfer. It would require your signature, but the request itself was filed using documentation that includes your name." Natalie stared at the screen. "Someone filed paperwork to initiate a transfer of my mother's apartment," she said slowly, "using my name without my knowledge." "Yes." "And nobody flagged this?" "The request is sitting in a queue at the county recorder's office. It hasn't been processed yet, but if it had been processed—" Rachel stopped. "The document includes what appears to be your signature on the authorization form." The room was very quiet. Natalie looked at the signature on the screen. It was close. Close enough that in a pile of routine paperwork, in an office that processes dozens of these requests a day, it might well have moved through. Not her signature, she could see the differences if she looked, but not an amateur forgery either. "Who filed it?" Charles asked. His voice had changed, lower, quieter, with the kind of control that comes right before something gives. Rachel hesitated. "The filing agent listed is a property management firm called Summit Bridge Partners," she said. "The principal listed for Summit Bridge is—" She checked her notes. "Vanessa Blake." The name landed in the room like something physical. Charles pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, and nobody said anything, because there are things a parent feels when they understand the full shape of what someone did to their child, and those things don't have clean expressions. Natalie looked at the signature on the screen. Her mother's apartment, the one with the closed room smell and the box in the closet and the floral ghost of a perfume she couldn't quite name. The last thing she had that was completely, unambiguously her mother's. Not the company, which was built and could be rebuilt, not the assets that could be quantified and recovered, but that specific place, those specific rooms. They had tried to take that too. She was aware of the anger now, not the abstract management of it from earlier in the day, but the actual thing, hot and very clear. It didn't make her want to move fast. If anything, it had the opposite effect. It made her very still. "Rachel," she said, "what do we need to do to make sure that transfer never goes through?" "I can file an injunction tonight. I'll call the recorder's office first thing and flag the document as fraudulent." Rachel had her phone out already. "We'll also want to get a handwriting expert to document that the signature is forged for the legal record." "Do it." "I'll need a few minutes to make calls." "Take whatever you need." Rachel stepped out. Daniel was quietly organizing his documents into the kind of careful stack that meant he was preparing to hand something over to someone. Charles turned away from the window. His face had the particular look of a man who has reached the bottom of a thing and found solid ground there, and is now deciding what to build on it. "He underestimated you," Charles said. "He underestimated what I had to lose," Natalie said. Which was true, and also not quite true. Ethan had understood very precisely what she had to lose. That was the point. He'd built his plan around it. What he'd gotten wrong was what she'd do about it. She picked up Helen's notebook from the conference table and turned to the page she'd marked. The overheard conversation. The detail about Charles doesn't look at this level. She looked at it for a moment, and then put the notebook in her bag. The evening outside the window had gone fully dark. The building's lobby, visible through the interior glass, was mostly quiet. A security guard at the desk, the soft industrial hum of office infrastructure. The city sounds muffled into something almost peaceful by height and glass. Daniel finished packing his bag. "I'll have the full report ready by tomorrow noon," he said. "There's more in the email archives. I need tonight to go through it. But the outline of what we've got is solid. This is buildable." "Thank you," Natalie said. After he left, she sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. She was tired in a way that went beyond the single day, tired in the particular way of someone who has been carrying a weight they didn't fully know they were carrying, and now that it's been named and identified, the body finally registers the effort it's been making. But under the tiredness was something she hadn't had that morning on Patricia's spare mattress with the spring digging into her back. Something that was not quite certainty. She wasn't naive enough to think this was going to be clean or quick, but was in the same neighborhood. She knew what she was dealing with now. She had names and numbers, and a notebook full of Helen Carter's careful handwriting, and a forensic accountant who was going home to spend the night in the email archives, and a corporate attorney who was standing in the hallway making calls to stop a fraudulent deed transfer. She knew what she was dealing with, and Ethan, somewhere across this city that was going about its ordinary evening business, did not yet know that she did. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. An unknown number. A 212 area code, Manhattan local. She answered it. "Natalie." The voice was familiar in the way that things you haven't heard in a while are still familiar. It lives in a particular register, a particular cadence. Diane Caldwell, Ethan's mother. Natalie said nothing. "I know you're angry," Diane said. Her voice had its usual smooth texture, the careful modulation of a woman who had spent decades managing conversations. "But I think there are things that need to be said, and I'd like to say them in person, tonight if possible. Could I come to the house?" She meant the Whitmore family estate in Westchester, the house where Natalie had grown up, where Charles still lived. "Tonight," Natalie repeated. "I know it's late, and I know this isn't how you would have wanted things to go. I just think we're past the point where pretending things are fine serves anyone." Natalie looked at the table in front of her. Daniel's preliminary notes, Rachel's legal pad, the spread of photographs from her mother's closet. She thought about what it meant that Diane was calling tonight. Not last week, not last month, not any of the months when this was being assembled and executed. Tonight, within hours of the divorce being finalized, which meant someone had told her something was happening. "You can come," Natalie said. 9 o'clock. She hung up and sat for another moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her father. "Diane Caldwell is coming to the house tonight," she said. 9 o'clock. A long pause. "All right," Charles said. His voice was steady. "I'll be here. Don't say anything to her before I arrive. I want to hear what she comes to say." "Natalie." Another pause. "Be careful with Diane. She's very good at making you feel like you're on the same side." "I know," Natalie said. She did know. She'd spent years on the same side as Diane Caldwell, or had believed she had. She knew exactly how good Diane was at it. That was precisely why she wanted to hear what she came to say. She gathered her things, turned off the conference room light, and walked toward the elevator. The notebook was in her bag. The photographs. Rachel's injunction would be filed tonight. Daniel was going through the archives. Diane Caldwell was coming to the house to say whatever it was she'd decided needed to be said. Natalie stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button and watched the floor numbers descend. She wasn't the same woman who had stood on those courthouse steps 12 hours ago, still holding her divorce papers, still in the first seconds of understanding what had been done to her. That woman had been trying to hold herself together. This one was trying to figure out what exactly she was going to build. The drive to Westchester took 40 minutes in light evening traffic, and Natalie spent most of it in the back of a car with her bag on her lap and her phone face down on the seat beside her, watching the city thin out into suburban darkness through the window. She'd called Patricia from the parking garage on Lexington to let her know she wouldn't be back that night. Patricia had asked 3 questions in quick succession. "Are you okay? Do you need me to come? Are you eating?" And Natalie had answered yes, no, and she'd get something later, which was probably a lie, but not the kind Patricia would push on. She hadn't eaten since the coffee that morning. That fact surfaced now, riding north on the Hutchinson River Parkway. In the particular way that neglected physical things surface when the adrenaline starts to thin. Not quite hunger, more a vague hollowness that reminded her body had been doing a lot of work today without much assistance. The driver said nothing, which she appreciated. She thought about Diane Caldwell the whole way up. Diane was 70 years old and carried herself like a woman who believed that composed behavior was both a personal virtue and a form of social dominance. She had good posture and an excellent memory, and a way of asking questions that always seemed conversational but were never actually casual. In 7 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, and the slow accumulation of occasions that marriage creates, Natalie had never seen Diane Caldwell say a wrong thing in public. She had also never fully trusted her, but she'd told herself that was her own anxiety talking, her tendency to be guarded with people who reminded her of how guarded they were being. Now she understood that instinct differently. The Whitmore estate in Westchester was not a mansion in the showy sense. It was a large, older house on 3.5 acres, built in the 1920s, the kind of place that had been renovated carefully enough to be comfortable without losing the particular weight of its age. Natalie had grown up here. She knew every room, every squeaky floorboard, every place where the lighting was bad, and every place where, on certain mornings, the light came through windows in a way that still stopped her. Charles had left the front entrance light on. She let herself in with her key. Her father was in the sitting room off the main hallway. Not the formal living room, the smaller one that her mother had used for reading, with the 2 armchairs angled toward each other and the lamp that threw a warm circle of light and nothing else. He had a glass of water on the table beside him and a folder in his lap that he closed when she walked in. "You didn't eat," he said. "I'll get something later." "There's soup on the stove. Mrs. Yuen left it." "After," Natalie said. She sat in the second armchair and set her bag on the floor. "What time is it?" 8:40. 20 minutes. She looked at the folder on his lap. "What's that?" "Things I pulled from the estate files this afternoon." He handed it to her. "Specifically the deed history on your mother's properties. I wanted to have it in front of me when Diane gets here." Natalie opened the folder. The deed for the Riverside Drive apartment was on top. Her mother's name, then the transfer to the estate, then the transfer to Natalie. Clean and documented, every step of it. Underneath were 2 other property records, a small piece of land in Connecticut and a stake in a commercial building in Midtown that her mother had held until the end. "Rachel filed the injunction?" Charles asked. "An hour ago. She texted me on the way up." Natalie closed the folder and handed it back. "The recorder's office will flag the Summit Bridge request first thing tomorrow morning. Rachel said the fraudulent document is detailed enough that we'll want a handwriting examiner before we do anything formal with it." "She has someone in mind?" "She said she'll have a name by morning." Charles nodded. He turned the folder over in his hands once and set it back on the table. "I want to ask you something before Diane gets here," he said. "Okay. How are you actually doing?" It wasn't quite a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was more like he was putting the space there deliberately, giving her room to fill it however she needed to. She thought about giving him the managed version. She'd been giving people the managed version all day. Rachel, Daniel, the cab drivers, Patricia on the phone. The version where she was holding it together and moving forward and focused on the problem. "I'm angry," she said. "I've been trying to keep it at a distance because I need to think clearly, but it's there. It's pretty significant, actually." Charles looked at her steadily. "Good," he said. She blinked. "Not the anger itself," he clarified, "but that you know it's there, that you're not pretending it isn't." He paused. "Your mother used to say that the most dangerous version of herself was the one who convinced everyone she was fine." Natalie looked at him for a moment. "I remember her saying that. She was talking about grief at the time, but I think it applies broadly." The house settled around them. The particular sounds of an old house at night, the ambient creaks and whispers of wood and pipe, and the occasional distant sound of the property's trees in the wind. Natalie had fallen asleep to those sounds for the first 22 years of her life, and they still lived somewhere in her body as a baseline of safety even when nothing else qualified. The doorbell rang at 8:58. Charles started to rise. "I'll get it," Natalie said. She stood and went to the door. Diane Caldwell was standing on the front step in a charcoal gray coat, her silver hair pulled back, her posture impeccable as always. She was carrying a small leather clutch and had the look of a woman who had prepared carefully for this visit, Not overdressed, not casual, nothing that could be read as either aggressive or submissive. The look of someone who had thought about optics. "Natalie," she said. Her voice was warm in the practiced way it had always been warm. "Thank you for seeing me." "Come in," Natalie said and stepped back. She led Diane into the sitting room. Charles was standing when they entered, and Diane's composure registered the room. The folders, the lamp, the specific configuration of two people who had clearly already been talking, without visibly reacting to any of it. "Charles," Diane said, "I'm sorry for the circumstances." "Diane," Charles said. That was all. They sat. Diane in the armchair Natalie had vacated, Charles in his, Natalie on the small settee to the side that put her at an angle to both of them. She'd chosen it deliberately. She didn't want to be directly across from Diane. She wanted to be able to watch Diane's face without being the focal point of the conversation. "I imagine you have questions," Diane began. "We do," Charles said. "But let's start with why you're here." Diane folded her hands in her lap. "I'm here because I believe things have gone further than they should have, and I think the situation needs to be resolved before it becomes something no one can walk back from." Natalie said nothing. He's ambitious," Diane continued. "I've always known that about him, and I won't pretend I didn't know he had certain plans regarding the business relationship with your company." She paused. "But some of what I've become aware of in the last few days, the scope of certain things, that's beyond what I was told was happening." Charles leaned forward slightly. "What specifically were you told was happening?" Diane met his gaze. "That Ethan had positioned people inside the Whitmore group who would be useful when it came time to negotiate a merger or acquisition of some kind, that it would give him leverage." "And you were comfortable with that?" Natalie said. She kept her voice level. Not cold, not heated, just asking. Diane turned to her. Something crossed her face that was real, or at least more complex than what she'd been showing. "I wasn't comfortable. I told him it was a mistake, that mixing family and business this way would end badly." She stopped. "He didn't listen to me. He hasn't listened to me about much of anything in several years." "What changed tonight?" Natalie asked. "Why are you here now?" Diane was quiet for a moment. "He told me this afternoon that the divorce was finalized," she said, "and he told me the next step was to move on the property transfer." She paused again, and this time the pause felt genuine rather than calculated. A person choosing their words not for effect, but because the words were actually difficult. "He was talking about your mother's apartment, Natalie. He was explaining that Vanessa had filed the preliminary paperwork and that he needed the process to move quickly before you had time to—" She stopped. "Before I had time to notice," Natalie said. "Yes." The sitting room was very quiet. "So you knew about the property transfer," Charles said. His voice was still controlled, but just barely. "I knew about it this afternoon when he told me it was already in motion." Diane looked at Charles directly. "I want to be honest with you about that because I think pretending otherwise would be both insulting and pointless." "What do you want from this conversation, Diane?" Natalie asked. The directness of it seemed to land. Diane shifted slightly. "Not much, but enough." "I want to offer to help you," she said. "Ethan has documents, communications, financial records that you may not have access to. If I had those, if I could provide them to you, it would—" "Why would you do that?" Natalie asked. "He's your son." Diane looked at her for a long moment. "Because what he is planning to do to that apartment is wrong," she said. "Your mother left you that property. I knew Margaret. Not well, but I knew her. And using a forged document to take the last thing she left you—" She stopped. Her voice had done something it hadn't done before, shifted out of its controlled register into something raw. "There are things I was willing to look the other way on. There are things I told myself were just business. This is not that." Natalie watched her carefully. The thing about Diane Caldwell was that she was genuinely intelligent and genuinely composed, which meant that when something cracked in her composure, you couldn't automatically assume it was manufactured. It might be real. It might also be deployed strategically. The difficulty was that Diane herself might not be able to tell the difference at this point. People who managed their feelings as tools sometimes lost track of where the tool ended and the feeling began. What Natalie was watching for was not whether Diane seemed sincere. She seemed sincere. That wasn't the question. The question was whether what Diane had to offer was actually useful, and whether accepting it came with a cost Natalie wasn't seeing yet. "Tell me what documents you're talking about," Natalie said. Diane hesitated. "Ethan keeps communications with the people he placed inside your company. Texts, emails. He's careful, but he's not as careful as he thinks he is. There are also records of the accounts where the vendor payments were redirected." She paused. "And there's something else. Something he didn't tell me directly, but that I found in his desk 2 weeks ago when I was at his apartment." She reached into the leather clutch and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She held it for a moment before handing it across to Natalie. Natalie unfolded it. It was a photocopy of what appeared to be an internal memo, not on Whitmore Group letterhead, but referencing the company by name. It was addressed to someone identified only by initials, and it laid out a timeline. Not the vendor payments, not the payroll manipulation. Those were already in motion and apparently considered settled. What this memo described was the next phase. Once the property transfer was complete, once the Riverside Drive apartment was in Vanessa Blake's name through Summit Bridge Partners, the plan was to sell it to a buyer who was already identified, a commercial developer who had expressed interest in the building's air rights. The sale price listed was substantial, and underneath the sale price, in a column labeled Distribution, was a breakdown. Ethan's share, Vanessa's share, and a third party Natalie didn't recognize, whose percentage was smaller but notable. She looked up. "Who is the third party?" she asked, pointing to the initials on the distribution column. Diane's expression was careful in a new way. "I don't know for certain. I think it may be the finance director who left your company, the one named Gorman." Charles made a sound that was not quite a word. "Alan Gorman," Natalie said slowly. "He left 8 months ago, with an enhanced pension." "I think the pension was the first payment," Diane said. "I think what's in that column is the second." The room was very quiet for a stretch of time that was hard to measure. Natalie set the photocopy on the table beside her with the care you give something that has weight. Not fragile exactly, but significant. A thing that needs to be placed rather than put down. "Why do we believe this is real?" Charles asked. He was looking at the photocopy. "You could have had this made." "You could verify it," Diane said. "The initials, the timeline, the buyer. Your attorney can pull property records, check who's been inquiring about air rights in that building. The buyer's name isn't on this document, but I know it. I'll give it to your attorney." "Why didn't you just call Rachel Morgan directly?" Natalie asked. "Because I wanted to talk to you first." Diane looked at her. "Not to your attorney, to you." Natalie looked at her for a long moment. She still didn't fully trust Diane Caldwell. She thought she probably never would, and she thought she was right not to. But there was something in what Diane had brought tonight. Not just the document, but the specific detail of it, the third party, the initials, the buyer, that had the texture of real information rather than a managed offering. Real information was specific. It had edges and inconsistencies, and it pointed toward things you hadn't known to look for. This pointed toward Alan Gorman, and that was a thread she wanted to pull. "You can stay tonight if you need to," Charles said. He said it in the voice of a man performing a duty rather than extending a genuine invitation, and Diane heard it that way. "No," she said. "I have a car waiting. I just needed to—" She stopped. "I needed you to know that I knew and that I came to tell you." She stood. Natalie stood with her out of reflex, the automatic courtesy that 7 years of family dinners had installed. At the door, Diane paused. "Natalie." She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her face had something on it that was hard to categorize. Not regret exactly, not guilt, but something in that territory. "When you married Ethan, I thought—" She stopped again. "I thought you were exactly what he needed. Someone steady, someone with real values." A pause. "I was right about that. I was wrong about what he would do with it." Natalie said nothing. Diane walked to the car. Natalie watched the headlights move down the driveway and disappear at the gate. She closed the door. Charles was standing in the hallway when she turned around. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think she's scared," Natalie said. "I think she came here partly because she has a conscience that showed up too late, and partly because she's watching her son's plan collapse, and she wants to be on the right side of it when it does. That doesn't make her wrong about what she brought." "No," Natalie said, "it doesn't." She went to the kitchen and called Rachel from the counter while the soup heated on the stove. Charles's housekeeper had left a pot of vegetable soup and a sleeve of crackers, and Natalie stood with one hand on the counter and the phone against her ear, watching the surface of the soup for the moment it would start to simmer. Rachel answered on the second ring. Natalie told her about Diane's visit, the document, the third-party initials. The name Diane had given her for the potential buyer, a commercial developer called Meridian Capital Group, which was different from Meridian Building Services and possibly coincidental, but possibly not. Alan Gorman, Rachel said. Are you serious? I'm telling you what Diane said and what the document implies. I can't verify either independently. No, I know. Rachel paused. He was on my list. From the personnel files Daniel flagged. I just didn't have anything connecting him to a payout beyond the pension. If he's also got a cut of the property sale, can you find out? I can subpoena his financial records if we can establish him as a party to the fraud. Which, if your handwriting examiner confirms the signature on the transfer document is forged, we may have standing. A pause. Natalie, this is becoming a serious case. We're not talking about civil fraud recovery anymore. We're talking about potential criminal exposure for Ethan, Vanessa, and possibly Gorman. I know. Is that what you want? She turned off the burner and watched the soup stop moving. What I want is for none of this to have happened, she said. What I want is for 7 years of my life not to have been a long con. Since I can't have that, yes. Whatever it takes to make sure they can't do this again, to us or to anyone else. Yes. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. I'll call the forensic handwriting analyst tonight. I know someone who can move quickly, and I'll start building the case for bringing in Gorman. Rachel. Yeah. Thank you. For today. The whole day. Don't thank me yet, Rachel said. Thank me when Ethan Caldwell is sitting across from a prosecutor explaining those Meridian invoices. After she hung up, Natalie ate soup standing over the sink because the table felt too deliberate. Sitting down at the table meant acknowledging the length of the day, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She ate without tasting much and watched the window above the sink, which showed nothing but the reflection of the kitchen back at her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Email archives are yielding a lot. There are CC threads involving Gorman, Stearns, and someone at Meridian Building Services going back 3.5 years. We'll have a full summary in the morning. This is solid. She set the phone face up on the counter so she could see it. Then she went to find her father. I was in the study, the room with the large oak desk that had been her grandfather's, that Charles had used since he inherited the business, that Natalie had always associated with the specific mix of authority and safety that fathers who are also bosses tend to carry. He was sitting behind the desk with the folder open in front of him and a pen in his hand, though he wasn't writing. Email archives from the company servers have communications going back 3.5 years, she said from the doorway. Gorman, Stearns, and someone at Meridian Building Services. Charles set the pen down. So the paper trail is there. Daniel says it's solid. Her father nodded slowly. He looked tired. Not defeated, but tired in the way you look when you've been holding tension in your body for longer than you knew, and you finally set it down somewhere. I should have moved faster, he said again. It was the second time he'd said it today. You moved when you could, Natalie said. I moved when you called me. Yes, she said. That's how it worked out. She wasn't going to tell him it was fine because it wasn't entirely fine. His waiting had cost them time and probably money and possibly information they'd never fully recover. But she also understood what it cost him to have watched the edges of a betrayal forming around his daughter and not known how to name it without naming it to her. Parents sometimes protected their children badly while meaning to protect them well. That was human. That was just how it went sometimes. What time is it? She asked. He checked his watch. Almost 11. I'm going to sleep in the guest room, she said. If that's all right. Natalie, this is your house. She looked at him. Okay. The blue room has clean sheets. Mrs. Ewan changed them yesterday. She went upstairs. The blue room was what they'd always called the guest room at the end of the hall, not because it was particularly blue, but because her mother had once painted the trim that color, and then changed her mind and repainted everything else. And the name had stuck through all subsequent renovations like a word that outlives its original meaning. Natalie sat on the edge of the bed with her shoes off, and her phone on the nightstand and her bag open on the chair in the corner. She was thinking about Ethan. Not about hating him. She was past that, or at least past it for tonight. She was thinking about the specific mechanics of what he'd built, the patience of it, the willingness to spend years constructing something that would take years to fully dismantle. She thought about herself at 31, walking into their first real conversation at a fundraiser on the West Side. She thought he was charming and a little too smooth but interesting underneath the smoothness. She thought he was someone who worked hard to project confidence because he'd had to develop it rather than being born with it, and she'd found that appealing. The sense of someone who'd made themselves rather than simply arrived. She'd been right about all of that. What she hadn't understood was that a person who makes themselves can make themselves into anything. She turned off the lamp. The dark in the blue room was the particular dark she knew from childhood. Not full dark, because the property lights left a glow at the edges of the curtains, and the house sounds were familiar and steady, and there was the distant noise of the road a half-mile away that had always been just loud enough to hear. She lay on her back and thought about the memo Diane had brought. The distribution column. Ethan's share, Vanessa's share, Gorman's initials. They had been very thorough. She gave them that. They had planned for almost every contingency. What they hadn't planned for was Helen Carter keeping a notebook. What they hadn't planned for was Diane Caldwell showing up with a photocopy and whatever complicated thing had moved her to do it. What they hadn't planned for was Natalie going to her mother's apartment first instead of directly to the office. The unplanned emotional decision to sit on the floor of a room she hadn't been able to bring herself to deal with, and finding a box in a closet behind winter coats that hadn't moved in years. Ethan had planned against the logical version of Natalie, the efficient one, the one who processed setbacks analytically and moved in straight lines. He hadn't planned against the one who needed to sit in her mother's apartment first. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow Daniel's full report would be ready. Tomorrow the handwriting examiner would review the forged signature. Tomorrow Rachel would start building the case against Gorman. Tomorrow was going to be full and relentless and complicated. But the evidence was there. It had been sitting in company servers and filing cabinets and a housekeeping manager's notebook and a cardboard box behind winter coats for years, waiting for someone to look. She had looked. She slept without meaning to, in the way you sometimes sleep when your body decides the decision has been made for you. Not peacefully exactly, but completely, all at once, the way a system shuts down when it has run out of resources to run on. And downstairs, in the study, Charles Whitmore sat at his grandfather's desk with the folder open in front of him and read every document in it twice, making notes in the margins. In the careful script his own father had once told him was too precise to ever be hurried, and somewhere across Westchester a car that had once carried Diane Caldwell back toward whatever she was returning to moved through the ordinary dark of a Tuesday night, and in Manhattan, Ethan Caldwell was sleeping the sleep of a man who did not yet know his plan had a hole in it large enough to come apart. He would find out soon. She was awake before 6. Not the sudden, alarmed waking of someone who'd slept badly, but the quiet, complete waking of a person whose brain had simply finished with sleep and decided it was time. The blue room was gray with early light filtering through the curtains, and for a moment she lay still and listened to the house. The particular morning sounds of it, the settling and the distant pipes, the birds she could hear starting up somewhere on the property. Then she picked up her phone. Daniel had sent a message at 2:47 in the morning. Full report attached. Read before you do anything else today. There's more than we thought. Rachel had sent one at 5:15. Handwriting examiner confirmed. The signature on the deed transfer document is not Natalie's. Expert is prepared to testify. Call me when you're up. And there was one from an unknown number, a different unknown number than Diane's, sent at 11:50 the previous night. It said, "You should know that Ethan is meeting with the buyer tomorrow morning at 10. Location, Meridian Capital Group offices, 47th and Lex. He thinks the transfer is going through." Natalie read that last one 3 times. Diane again, from a different phone, which meant Diane was being careful about which number she used for which category of information. She sat up and called Rachel. Rachel answered immediately, sounding like a person who had been awake for a while. "You got the handwriting confirmation." "Just saw it, and I got a message from Diane last night. Ethan is meeting with the buyer this morning at 10, Meridian Capital Group." A short silence. "She's feeding you his schedule." "Yes." "From a different number than last night." Yes. She's scared of him, Rachel said. Not a question. That or she's being strategic. Maybe both. Natalie got up and went to the window. The property was still in that early pale light that made everything look provisional, like the day hadn't fully committed to itself yet. What do I do with it? You let me make some calls, Rachel said. If Ethan walks into that meeting intending to complete a fraudulent property transfer, we want to be positioned to intercept that. Not physically, legally. I need the court order from yesterday's injunction in front of the right people before 10 o'clock. Can you do that? I've done harder things before 9 a.m. A pause. Read Daniel's report. There's something in there about the Gorman connection that changes the scope of what we're dealing with. I want you to have read it before we talk next. After she hung up, Natalie sat at the small desk in the corner of the blue room with her phone and opened Daniel's attached report. It was 41 pages. She read it in an hour and 10 minutes, which meant she was skimming the supporting detail and reading the summaries and flagging the parts that made her stop. There were several parts that made her stop. The email archives had produced exactly what Daniel had suspected, but more of it than anyone had expected. There were threads going back 3 years and 8 months, before Natalie had noticed anything wrong, before Charles had noticed the maintenance contract discrepancy, before Paul Stearns had retired with his enhanced pension, that showed a coordinated communication network between Ethan, a personal email account connected to Alan Gorman, someone at Meridian Building Services using a private address, and in the later threads, Vanessa Blake. The language in the emails was careful, in the way that people are careful when they think they're being careful but aren't actually careful enough. They use terms like the arrangement and our timeline and the asset question rather than naming things directly. But the context was clear, and Daniel had done the work of annotating each thread with the relevant transaction it corresponded to. The thing that stopped Natalie was a thread from 18 months ago. Ethan had written to Gorman, "The issue is her connection to the Park Avenue property. If she becomes involved in the day-to-day before we close the vendor side, she'll see it. Keep her out of hotel operations until after Q3. Gorman had replied, "Understood. I'll route the quarterly review through Stearns." Natalie read that twice. They had specifically managed her access. They had kept her out of certain operational reviews, and she'd thought, at the time, that it was just the natural boundary between her role in the company and the hotel division's management. She hadn't pushed because she hadn't had a reason to push. She'd trusted that the people running the day-to-day were doing their jobs. They'd counted on that trust. She put the phone down and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she went downstairs. Charles was already in the kitchen with coffee made and the folder from last night on the table beside him, which meant he hadn't moved it from where he'd been reading and had just come back to it this morning. He looked up when she came in. "You read Daniel's report?" he asked. "Just finished it." "The part about the quarterly review routing?" "Yes." She poured coffee and sat across from him. "They kept me out of it deliberately." "They kept us both managed," Charles said. He said it with the flat evenness of someone who has already processed his portion of this and is now past the feeling part and into the action part. Stearns routing the hotel reviews to himself, Gorman handling the financial flags. They had enough people in the right positions that nothing unusual would surface to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it. "And nobody was looking specifically for it," Natalie said. "Not until you called me from those courthouse steps." She drank her coffee. It was strong, the way Charles had always made it. Her mother used to joke that he made coffee like he was solving a problem. "Ethan is meeting with the Meridian Capital buyer at 10 o'clock, she said, "at their offices on 47th. Charles set his cup down. "Diane sent me the information last night," Natalie said. "Second message, different phone." "She's choosing a side." "She's covering herself," Natalie said. "But the information might be real either way, so it doesn't much matter why she's giving it." "What does Rachel say?" "That she needs to get the injunction in front of the right people before 10. She's making calls." Natalie looked at her phone. It was just past 7:15. "I need to be in the city. I should go now if I'm going to be useful." "What exactly do you plan to do?" "Be there," she said simply. Charles looked at her for a moment. "That's not a plan." "Rachel has the plan. I'm going to be there when it executes." She stood up and set the coffee cup in the sink. "I'll call you when I know something." "Natalie." She turned. "Take the car," he said. "Don't take a cab. Take the car and call me the moment anything happens." She took the car. The drive into the city was against traffic, which meant it moved well, and she spent it on the phone with Rachel, who was simultaneously giving her an update and managing something on a second line because Natalie could hear the clicking of Rachel switching back and forth. "The injunction is already in the system from last night," Rachel said. "What I'm doing right now is making sure that Meridian Capital Group's legal team knows about it before Ethan walks into their building. If their counsel is competent, and they're a serious firm, so they should be, the meeting is going to end before it begins. What if their counsel doesn't flag it in time? Then we have other options. But let's try the clean version first." A pause, the sound of Rachel's other line, then she was back. "I also called the county recorder's office at 7 this morning. The Summit Bridge request has been formally flagged as disputed. Nothing moves on that property without a court order now." Natalie exhaled. "What about Gorman?" "I've drafted a request for his financial records through the fraud investigation. It goes to the judge this morning. If she signs it, and I think she will, based on what Daniel's report establishes, we'll have access to his accounts within 48 hours. Rachel, is this enough to bring to prosecutors?" A longer pause. "The email archives alone are significant," Rachel said. "The forged signature on the deed document is significant. The vendor fraud documentation is significant. Any one of those is a problem for Ethan. All three together, plus Gorman's potential involvement, yes. I think we can take this to the DA's office and have a serious conversation." "When?" "I want to wait until after this morning. If Ethan walks into that Meridian Capital meeting and the deal falls apart in his face, we'll know exactly how much of the scheme was still active versus how much was already being wound down. That matters for how the case gets framed." Natalie watched the skyline come into view through the car window as they crossed the bridge. The specific site of Manhattan from the approach, familiar enough that she usually stopped seeing it, but today it looked deliberate somehow, like a thing that was declaring itself. "I want to be there when it falls apart," she said. "I know you do," Rachel said. "Come to my office. We'll watch it from there." Rachel's offices were on 51st Street, which was close enough to 47th that if you stood at the right window, you could theoretically look in that direction and feel like you were doing something. Natalie arrived at 8:40 to find Rachel in a blazer she'd clearly put on over the clothes she'd been wearing when she started making calls, with 4 different folders open on her desk and her assistant standing in the doorway taking notes. Daniel was there too, which she hadn't expected. He was sitting in the corner with his laptop and his legal pad and the same distracted focus energy he'd had the day before, though he looked like he'd slept maybe 2 hours. "You didn't have to come in," Natalie said. "I wanted to see how it landed," Daniel said simply. Rachel's assistant left. Rachel closed 2 of the 4 folders and looked at Natalie. "I talked to Meridian Capital's general counsel 20 minutes ago. He confirmed they have a 10 o'clock with a representative of Summit Bridge Partners regarding a property on Riverside Drive." She paused. "I told him the property is subject to a formal fraud injunction and that completing any transaction related to it would expose Meridian Capital to civil liability. I sent him the injunction documentation." "What did he say?" "He said he needed to consult with his team and would get back to me. He hasn't yet." She glanced at her phone. "It's 8:43. He has about an hour before his problem walks in the door." They waited. The office had the particular tense quiet of people who are waiting for something and cannot speed it up. Rachel worked through her folders. Daniel typed steadily on his laptop. Natalie sat in the chair across from Rachel's desk and drank the coffee that Rachel's assistant had left, and looked at her phone without touching it because there was nothing on it that required attention, and looking at it anyway was just anxiety with a prop. At 9:17, Rachel's phone rang. She answered, listened for 40 seconds without saying much, and then said, "Oh, thank you. I appreciate you acting quickly." She hung up. "Meridian Capital is canceling the meeting," she said. "The simple fact of it," said in Rachel's flat, professional voice, in this office with its 4 folders and its city view, landed with a weight that didn't match the quietness of its delivery. Natalie said, "He doesn't know yet." "No," Rachel said. "He'll find out when he gets there." Daniel looked up from his laptop. "Do you want to know something almost elegant about this?" "What?" Natalie said. "The meeting was scheduled for conference room B on the 14th floor. According to Meridian Capital's website, that room has a street-facing window." He paused. "He's going to walk into a building expecting to close a deal and find a room full of lawyers telling him it's over, and then he's going to have to walk back out onto the street. Nobody said anything for a moment. I'm not celebrating that, Natalie said. No, Daniel said. I know. But she understood what he meant. It wasn't celebration. It was just the specific, slightly vertiginous satisfaction of watching a thing land after you've spent a long time watching it in the air. At 10:23, Rachel's phone rang again. This time it was a longer call. Natalie could hear the voice on the other end, but not the words. A male voice, clipped and moving fast. The voice of someone managing an unexpected situation. Rachel listened, asked 3 precise questions, wrote something on her legal pad, and said, "Tell him to contact his attorney." She hung up. "That was Meridian Capital's general counsel again," she said. Ethan Caldwell arrived at 10 o'clock, was taken to a conference room, and was informed by their legal team that the transaction cannot proceed due to an active fraud injunction on the property. She set the phone down. He apparently disputed that, asked to see the documentation. When they showed it to him, she paused. He told them the injunction was based on false information filed by his ex-wife. Natalie's jaw tightened slightly. Their counsel told him that their obligation was to the documentation as filed and that any dispute would need to go through the courts. He left the building at 10:18. 8 minutes. He'd been in there for 8 minutes before walking back out onto 47th Street. Natalie thought about what those 8 minutes must have felt like. She thought about that for one moment, and then she let it go because dwelling in it wasn't useful and wasn't who she wanted to be coming out of this. "Rachel," she said, "what's next?" "I want to file the formal fraud complaint this afternoon," Rachel said. "With the email archives, the handwriting expert's affidavit, the vendor documentation, and the deed transfer attempt. We have enough to open a criminal inquiry. That's separate from the civil recovery process for the financial damages, which will take longer but is also solid." "And Gorman?" "I expect the judge to sign the financial records request today. Once I have that, I'll know how much of the distribution from the Riverside Drive sale was already promised to him. That connects the property fraud to the payroll manipulation through a common financial motive, which strengthens both cases." Rachel folded her hands on the desk. "This is going to take months, Natalie, probably longer. I don't want you to think today is the ending of this." "I know it's not. But today is significant." "I know that too." Daniel closed his laptop. He looked tired in a way that had moved past tiredness into some flat zone on the other side of it. "For whatever it's worth," he said, "in 12 years of forensic accounting, this is one of the cleaner evidentiary pictures I've worked with. They were sloppy in places they thought didn't matter. That tends to be how it goes." "How so?" Natalie asked. "People who are meticulous about the big things get lazy about the small ones. The vendor fraud was careful, but the email communication was not. And the payroll manipulation?" He shook his head. "They were skimming from hourly workers. Small amounts per person, spread across 11 employees. Nothing that would trigger an automatic audit flag. But small amounts across 11 people still require someone to maintain the discrepancy records. And whoever was maintaining them kept the originals." "Where?" "In a shared folder on the hotel's internal server," Daniel said, "under a directory called Maintenance Archives 2021. A pause. "I don't think anyone ever expected someone to look there." Helen Carter had looked. She'd looked because she was paying attention to things that were invisible to people who had decided what they were going to see before they looked. Natalie thought about Helen in the third-floor office with the air shaft view, writing dates and names in a drugstore notebook because she didn't know who to trust, and she needed the information to exist somewhere. "I want to make sure Helen Carter is protected in whatever comes next," Natalie said. "Her employment, her pension, whatever she's entitled to, I want that reviewed and secured." "Already on my list," Rachel said. Natalie nodded. She stood up because sitting still had become difficult in a way it hadn't been earlier, not with agitation, but with the particular restlessness of someone who has been holding themselves very steady for a long time and is starting to feel the cost of it. She walked to the window. 51st Street in late morning, the ordinary city doing what it did, cabs and pedestrians and a food truck creating a backup at the corner. Somewhere about 4 blocks south and 1 Avenue east, Ethan Caldwell was doing whatever people do after they've walked out of a building where their plan just ended. She didn't know if he was calling a lawyer or calling Vanessa or standing on a sidewalk trying to regroup or already constructing his next version of events. She hoped he was calling a lawyer. She hoped that very specifically because a lawyer would tell him the same thing Rachel had just told her so. That this was going to take months, that the documentation was extensive, that the email archives and the handwriting examination and the forensic accounting report and the 11 hotel workers whose pay records had been altered were all part of a picture that was not going to be easy to argue against. She hoped he was starting to understand the shape of what was coming. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was Ethan's. She stood at Rachel's window for a moment, watching the food truck situation resolve itself, a cab finally getting around it. Then she answered. Natalie. His voice was tight in a way she hadn't heard before. Not the courthouse smoothness, not the managed confidence. Something rawer. I need you to call off whatever you've filed. This has gone further than it needs to. She said nothing. The Meridian Capital meeting. That was a business arrangement that had nothing to do with you. The property question can be resolved without… Ethan, she said. He stopped. There's nothing to call off, she said. This isn't something I'm doing. This is documentation that exists and processes that are running and people who are doing their jobs. I don't have a switch. You could tell your attorney, my attorney is building a fraud case. I'm not going to ask her to stop. A silence. You're making a mistake, he said. His voice had shifted into something she recognized from the marriage, the tone he used when he was trying to make her feel like she was the one causing the problem. I have resources you're not accounting for. People who will… Ethan. She kept her voice even. Not cold, not heated. Even. If you want to talk to someone, call your attorney. That's genuinely my advice. She paused. Don't call me again. She hung up. Her hand was steady. She noticed that specifically. She noticed that her hand was steady and her breathing was normal, and the thing she felt was not the old familiar anxiety of having disappointed him or made him angry or been the cause of conflict. It was something else, something simpler. She turned back to the room. Rachel was watching her with the careful expression of someone who has seen people in high-stress situations and knows when to say something and when not to. That was Ethan, Natalie said. I figured. He wants me to call it off. Of course he does. I told him to call his attorney. Rachel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Good, she said. Daniel was looking at his laptop again. He'd found something, apparently, because he had the slightly arrested look of a person in the middle of a thought. Daniel, Natalie said. He looked up. The Meridian Capital Group, he said. The buyer for the Riverside Drive property. What about them? I've been pulling their public filing history this morning. He turned the laptop toward her. They have a pattern of acquiring air rights in residential buildings on the west side. It's a specific strategy. They develop the vertical space above existing structures. It's legal and they're good at it. He paused. But the Riverside Drive building is a landmarked building. It has restrictions on air rights development. Natalie looked at the screen. So the sale wouldn't have worked anyway. The air rights sale wouldn't have. The straight property sale would have. But Meridian Capital's interest was specifically the air rights. That's what Ethan told them they were buying. Daniel sat back, which means either he was misrepresenting the property to the buyer or he hadn't done the due diligence to know the restriction existed. Which is it? Daniel considered. Given everything else we've seen about how this was planned, I think he knew. I think he was going to complete the sale and let the air rights question become the buyer's problem. Rachel made a sound that was not quite a laugh. So even if we hadn't stopped it, the transaction was going to blow up eventually when Meridian Capital's development team ran into the landmark restriction. Most likely, yes. Natalie thought about that. A plan constructed over years, inside a family, at the cost of a marriage and 11 workers' wages and $3.5 million of fraudulent vendor payments, and it was going to end one way or another, either stopped by an injunction or detonated by a landmarked building's air rights restriction that nobody had thought to check. She wasn't sure whether that was satisfying or just sad. Probably both. I'm going to go see Helen Carter, she said. Rachel looked up. Now? She's at the hotel. I want to tell her in person what's happening. Natalie picked up her bag. She spent 3 years keeping that notebook because she didn't know who to talk to. She should hear it from me, not through a process. Rachel nodded slowly. That's… She started to say something and stopped. What? I was going to say that's generous, Rachel said. But it's not, really. It's just right. Natalie took a cab to the Whitmore Park. The Park Avenue lobby had its usual managed hush at mid-morning. A few check-ins, a bellman moving luggage, the quiet industry of a hotel doing its daily work. Natalie walked through it the way she had hundreds of times, past the front desk, whose staff she mostly knew by name, up to the third floor and down the corridor with its slightly worn carpeting. Helen was in the office with the air shaft view at her desk, with a coffee going cold beside her keyboard in a way that suggested she'd been at something for a while and forgotten about it. She looked up when Natalie knocked on the open door. "I was going to call you," Helen said. "I know." Natalie sat down in the chair across the desk. "I wanted to come." She told Helen what had happened. Not the full 41-page version, the version a person needed to hear, the version with the shape of it clear, the evidence they had, the injunction, the meeting that had collapsed that morning, where things were headed. Helen listened without interrupting, which was exactly what she'd done when Natalie was telling her own story. When Natalie finished, Helen was quiet for a moment. "The 11 employees," Helen said. "Their back pay. That's part of the civil recovery process. Rachel is going to make sure it's addressed." Helen nodded. She was looking at her desk, at something Natalie couldn't identify. "There was a woman named Gloria. She was here 14 years. Good worker. Faster than anyone I've had in housekeeping. She noticed her checks were short and went to HR and was told she was wrong, and she believed them because she was scared of losing the job." Helen paused. "She didn't lose the job, but she believed them and she stopped pushing." "I know," Natalie said. "She should hear from someone that she wasn't wrong." "She will," Natalie said. "As part of the process, the employees will be informed of the findings and what they're owed. Rachel will make sure of that." Helen picked up her coffee, realized it was cold, and put it down. She had the look of someone at the end of a long-held breath. Not relief exactly, but release, which is different. Relief is about the thing going away. Release is about being able to put down the thing you've been carrying. "Your mother used to say that a company is only as good as the people who feel safe enough to tell the truth in it," Helen said. Natalie looked at her across the desk. "I know," she said. "I'm going to try to build that." She meant it. She wasn't sure entirely what it would look like yet, what structures or policies or specific changes would make it real rather than just an intention. But she meant it in the particular way you mean things when you've just watched what happens when no one feels safe enough to tell the truth, and the cost of that silence has a dollar figure attached to it. And 11 names. She stayed at the hotel for an hour, walking the floors. Not inspecting, not auditing, just present. She stopped and talked to people she knew, introduced herself to people she didn't, and felt the difference between a building she'd known abstractly as an asset and a building she was standing inside with the specific weight of what it contained. When she left, she called her father from the lobby. "The meeting fell apart," she said. "Ethan left the building in 8 minutes." Charles exhaled. "And Rachel?" "Filing the formal fraud complaint this afternoon. It's going to take months." "I know. Are you okay with that?" A pause that held more than it seemed to. "I'm okay with doing whatever it takes for as long as it takes," he said. "I should have said that a year ago." "You're saying it now." She stepped out onto Park Avenue. The city was fully underway in its midday mode. The particular midday energy of Manhattan in October, cold and bright and relentless. She started walking south. She had calls to return and things to read, and a conversation with Rachel scheduled for 3 o'clock about the fraud complaint. She had a company to understand more deeply than she'd understood it before, and 11 employees whose back pay needed to be included in a civil recovery case and a forensic accountant's report. She'd read fast this morning and needed to read again slowly. She had a lot of work ahead of her. Ethan's call was still sitting in her recent calls list. She looked at it once while she was walking and then put the phone in her bag. Whatever he was doing right now, whatever regroup or re-strategize or call to a lawyer was happening on his end of this, was no longer something she could see or control, and she'd decided sometime in the last 24 hours that she was going to stop trying to track the parts of this she couldn't influence and focus on the parts she could. That decision wasn't complete. It wasn't clean. She'd probably break it a few times in the coming weeks, check for his name in news, wonder what was happening in rooms she wasn't in. That was human, and she was human. But she was walking south on Park Avenue in the October light, and the injunction was filed, and the fraud complaint was being drafted, and Helen Carter's notebook was in Rachel Morgan's possession, and the work was underway. That was enough for right now. That was for right now. Enough. The fraud complaint was filed at 4:17 on a Thursday afternoon, and Natalie wasn't in the room when it happened. She was sitting in her car outside the Whitmore Park on a call with Sandra Okafor about the hotel's Q4 staffing projections when Rachel sent a text that said simply, "Filed. It's in the system." Natalie read it during a pause in the conversation, set the phone face down on the passenger seat, and finished the call. Sandra was thorough and precise and had questions about 3 different line items that deserved real answers, and Natalie gave them real answers because the work didn't pause for milestones. That was the first thing she'd learned in the months since the courthouse steps. The work didn't pause for milestones. She'd expected the filing to feel like something, a door closing or opening, or at minimum a distinct sound of some kind. Instead, it felt like what it was: a document submitted, a process begun, one step in something that would take considerably longer than a single afternoon. Rachel had told her that. She'd listened. But there's a difference between hearing something and understanding it in your body, and the understanding came slowly, over weeks, in the particular way that large truths about how the world works tend to arrive, not in one moment, but in the accumulation of many smaller ones. The investigation moved the way investigations move when they involve multiple parties, multiple financial threads, and a forensic accounting report that kept expanding as Daniel Brooks pulled more from the email archives. Methodically, sometimes slowly, with occasional surges that Rachel would call to report in that clipped, focused voice she used when something significant had landed. Alan Gorman's financial records came back 14 days after Daniel's initial report. They confirmed what Diane's photocopy had implied. Gorman had received a wire transfer of $240,000 into a personal account 3 weeks before his voluntary retirement from the Whitmore Group. The source of that transfer was a shell account connected to a holding company that, when traced, linked back to the same network of entities that had been processing the vendor fraud payments. His enhanced pension had been the down payment. The $240,000 had been the second installment. The distribution from the Riverside Drive sale, which had never happened because of the injunction, would have been the third. When Rachel called to tell her, Natalie was in the middle of eating lunch at her desk in the Whitmore Group's Lexington Avenue offices, where she'd been working full-time since the week after the courthouse. She set down her fork and listened to Rachel lay out the numbers and said almost nothing until Rachel finished. "Is he cooperating?" she asked. "His attorney reached out this morning," Rachel said, which usually means the answer is going to become yes. Gorman was 58 years old with a wife and 2 adult children and a house in New Jersey that he'd spent 25 years paying off. Natalie didn't know what he'd told himself when he'd taken the first payment, what story he'd constructed to make it acceptable. That Ethan was family, that no one would get hurt, that it was just business. She'd never asked, and she didn't plan to. But she thought about it sometimes, briefly, in the way you think about the human mechanics of a betrayal when you're far enough from it to be curious rather than just wounded. People didn't usually do things like this because they were simply bad. They did them because something, money, loyalty, fear, ego, the slow accumulation of small compromises, had moved them from where they started to somewhere they couldn't have imagined going when they set out. Gorman had been a competent finance director for 9 years before Ethan had found the lever. That didn't excuse it. But it was true, and she decided that looking at true things clearly was better than looking away from the parts that complicated the picture. Vanessa Blake's attorney contacted Rachel in the 6th week. Vanessa was not charged separately from the conspiracy case, but her role in filing the Summit Bridge deed transfer request and her documented presence in communications related to the property fraud made her a named party in the civil complaint. Her attorney wanted to discuss the terms under which she might provide testimony. Rachel told Natalie this on a Friday morning, and Natalie's immediate reaction was a fatigue that had nothing to do with being tired. It was the specific fatigue of realizing a person who had hurt you was going to be useful to the process that protected you, which required you to hold both of those things at once. "Do we need her testimony?" Natalie asked. "It would help with certain elements of the timeline," Rachel said, specifically the chronology of when the Summit Bridge filing was initiated relative to the divorce proceedings. "But we can build the case without it." "Then build it without it," Natalie said. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Understood. She hadn't made that decision out of anger. Or not only out of anger. She'd made it because there was a version of this where she spent the next year watching the woman who had helped take her marriage apart sit across from her in a deposition and answer questions. And she'd decided that version wasn't one she needed to participate in if she had a choice. She had a choice. She used it. Ethan hired 3 attorneys over the course of the investigation. The first one lasted 4 weeks before being replaced by a more aggressive firm that specialized in white-collar defense. The second lasted 6 weeks. The third was still representing him when the DA's office formally charged him in month 4 with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Natalie heard about the charges from Rachel, then saw them referenced briefly in a business news item that she read once and didn't go back to. She didn't follow the coverage. She had people who would tell her what she needed to know, and everything else was noise that she'd decided in advance she wasn't going to consume. The decision to not follow the coverage was harder than it sounded. There were nights when she picked up her phone and started typing his name into a search bar and then put the phone down. Not because she was above curiosity, she wasn't, but because she'd learned something about herself in those months that she hadn't fully known before. That her worst patterns of thinking started with information she didn't need and couldn't act on. Looking up Ethan's legal situation at 11 o'clock at night wasn't going to change anything about the next morning. It was just going to take up space in her head that had better uses. She got better at putting the phone down. Not perfect, just better. The civil recovery process was slower than the criminal case, more procedural, more granular. Daniel Brooks remained on retainer through the whole of it, and Natalie met with him twice a month for what he called progress reviews, and what she thought of as the slow arithmetic of getting back what had been taken. Some of it came back more readily than others. The vendor account funds, the ones that hadn't already been disbursed, were partially recoverable through the injunctions Rachel had filed early. The Meridian Building Services account still had a portion of what they'd received, and Christopher Caldwell's attorney negotiated a settlement rather than face the full exposure of the trial. The amounts were significant. They were also, in the broader context of a company the size of the Whitmore Group, manageable. The fraud had not broken them. It had cost them, in money and time and the particular invisible cost of betrayal, which doesn't show up in financial statements but is real anyway. The 11 employees whose pay had been manipulated received their back pay in month 3, with interest calculated to the day. Rachel had insisted on the interest, and Natalie had supported it without hesitation. The checks came from the Whitmore Group directly, with a letter that didn't use the word sorry, because sorry wasn't quite right, and they'd talked about the language carefully. But that acknowledged the wrong, named the amount, and committed to a review of payroll processes going forward. Gloria, the housekeeper Helen had mentioned, 14 years faster than anyone, came to find Natalie at the hotel 2 days after the checks went out. She wasn't looking for a conversation exactly. She stood at the door of the small office where Natalie was working and said, "I got the letter." "I know," Natalie said. "I'm glad it reached you." Gloria was quiet for a moment. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, with the posture of someone who had spent decades on her feet and had made her peace with it. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The letter said the payroll process is being reviewed. What does that mean exactly?" Natalie put down the folder she was holding. "It means we're implementing a third-party audit of all hourly payroll records quarterly, and we're creating a direct line to the legal team, anonymous if people want it, so that if someone sees something that doesn't look right, there's somewhere to bring it that isn't HR." Gloria considered that. "Helen knew," Natalie said. "She kept records because she didn't have anywhere to take them. That shouldn't have happened. It won't happen the same way again." "Okay," Gloria said. She didn't say thank you. She said okay, which was more honest and also more sufficient. She went back to work. Natalie sat with that for a moment, and then she went back to work too. The thing about rebuilding, the thing nobody tells you before you're in it, is that it doesn't feel like building. It doesn't have the forward momentum of building something new. It feels more like clearing over and over, getting to the same ground from different angles, and finding something that needs to be looked at more carefully than you'd managed to look at it before. She was clearing ground on the vendor contracts when she discovered that 4 of the companies they'd been doing legitimate business with, genuinely legitimate, no fraud involved, had been brought in originally through Ethan's network and had pricing that reflected that relationship. They weren't stealing from the company. They were just overcharging because they'd been able to, because the person who approved their contracts had an interest in keeping them happy. She renegotiated all four. She discovered that the hotel's benefit structure for hourly employees hadn't been reviewed in 7 years, not because anyone had deliberately neglected it, but because the people who should have reviewed it were either managing the fraud or managing around the fraud and had other priorities. She fixed that. She spent 2 weeks in the Whitmore Group's property management division learning the functions she'd been routed away from 18 months earlier, the ones she never should have been kept out of. Sandra Okafor walked her through the reporting structures with the patient thoroughness of someone who was glad to have a reason to explain things to someone who would actually use what she learned. "You're going to be hands-on," Sandra said one afternoon. It wasn't a question. "Is that a problem?" Sandra looked at her. "No, it's just different." "From my father or from what you were used to in the last few years?" Sandra was quiet for a beat. "Both," she said. "Your father's approach is, he trusts the structure. He delegates broadly and expects the structure to catch things. And that didn't work." "Not entirely, no." "Then we're going to build a different structure," Natalie said. "And I'm going to understand it well enough to know what it should catch." Sandra nodded. "That sounds right," she said. It was the kind of endorsement that was more valuable for being understated. Sandra Okafor didn't give out easy approval. Natalie had figured that out in the first 10 minutes of knowing her. Charles watched all of this from a slight remove. Not disconnected, not absent, but deliberately stepping back in the way a person steps back when they understand that their stepping back is what's needed. He still came into the office 3 days a week. He still attended board meetings. But the operational decisions, the vendor reviews, the staffing restructuring, those were Natalie's. And he'd said so to the board in the clearest possible terms in the meeting where they'd presented Daniel's report and Rachel's legal summary. "My daughter has understood this company better than I gave her credit for," he'd said. He was looking at the board when he said it, not at Natalie. "And she's going to run it. I want everyone in this room to understand that." She'd been sitting 3 chairs down from him at the table. She'd kept her face neutral because that was the professional thing to do. Later, alone in the elevator going down, she'd let herself feel it. The specific, complicated weight of being recognized by a parent in a room full of people, at an age and in circumstances that made it mean something different than it would have meant 20 years ago. Not just pride. Something more mixed than pride. The bittersweet version of it, the one that comes with the awareness of what had to happen first. She didn't call Patricia that night. She called her instead 2 weeks later, over dinner at the Italian place on Columbus that they'd been going to for 15 years. And she told her everything properly. Not the managed version, the whole version, with the parts that were still unresolved and the parts that still hurt, and the parts that were, against all odds, genuinely okay. Patricia listened the way she always had, with the particular quality of attention that made you feel like what you were saying mattered, without making you feel like you were being processed. "How are you sleeping?" Patricia asked when Natalie finished. "Better than I was," Natalie said. "Not great, but better." "Are you eating?" "More or less." "Are you—" Patricia stopped, started again. "Are you okay?" In the actual way, not the functional way. Natalie looked at her across the table. The restaurant was warm and loud and smelled like garlic and bread and the ordinary pleasures of being somewhere people gather to feed each other. "I think so," she said. "I don't know yet. I think it's going to take longer to know than I thought." "That's an honest answer." "I'm working on honest answers." Patricia picked up her wine. "Do you miss him?" Natalie had been waiting for that question, or some version of it, for months. She'd been waiting for it from Patricia, from her father, from herself. "I miss who I thought he was," she said, "which is different from missing him. But I didn't know the difference for a while." "That's—" Patricia paused. "That's actually very clear." I had a lot of time to think about it. The truth was more complicated even than that, in the way that truths about marriages usually are. She had not simply been deceived from day one. There had been real things in those 7 years. Moments, conversations, the particular texture of 2 people building a life together that is not entirely performance, not entirely false. Ethan was not a man with no real feelings. She believed that. What he was a man whose feelings existed alongside a capacity for self-interest, so large and so unexamined that it eventually swallowed everything else. That was harder to sit with than a simple story about a villain would have been. But it was closer to true. She'd made her own errors too, and she'd spent time with those. Not in the destructive way, not the loop of self-blame that goes nowhere and hurts for no reason, but in the way you have to if you want to understand something and not just survive it. She'd trusted too completely. She'd accepted the frame of his family's involvement because it had come wrapped in the language of belonging, and she'd wanted to belong to something larger than herself. She'd been warned and hadn't listened, and not because she was naive, but because listening would have meant dismantling something she'd invested years in, and that was a harder thing to do than people who haven't been in it tend to understand. She understood it now. The criminal case against Ethan resolved in month 7. His third attorney negotiated a plea agreement that kept him out of a full trial. Guilty on 2 counts, fraud and conspiracy, with restitution to the Whitmore Group as a condition of the settlement. The sentence was structured around the restitution. He would not see a jail cell provided the payments were made on schedule, and continued. Natalie had been asked by Rachel whether she wanted to make a victim impact statement for the record. She'd thought about it for a week. In the end, she said no. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood, imperfectly, not without some complicated feeling about the choice, that the statement would be for her and not for the process. The process didn't need her pain on the record. The record was already full. What she needed from this was the restitution, the accountability, and the ability to stop spending energy on Ethan Caldwell and use it somewhere else. That was what she needed. She asked Rachel to confirm the plea was accepted and the restitution schedule was in place, and then she put the phone down and went back to the vendor review she'd been working on. That was on a Tuesday in March, 8 months after the courthouse steps. She found out later from Rachel that Ethan had been in the building at the same time she was. Different floor, different corridor, the particular logistical coincidence that a city of 10 million people produces without effort or intention. She hadn't seen him. He hadn't seen her. They'd been in the same building for maybe 40 minutes and never crossed paths. She thought about that briefly when Rachel mentioned it. Then she thought about the vendor review, which needed to be finished by Thursday, and moved on. The civil recovery was concluded in month 11. The total recovered, from the vendor accounts, the shell company settlements, Gorman's negotiated restitution, and Christopher Caldwell's settlement, came to just under $2.1 million against a total loss of $3.8 million documented in Daniel's report. Not everything, not close to everything, but more than Rachel had initially projected as recoverable, which meant the early work of freezing accounts and filing injunctions before anyone on the other side could move money had mattered. Daniel sent her a summary email the day the final transfer cleared. It was professional and detailed, and at the very end, after all the figures and the account references, he'd written, "For what it's worth, this is one of the better outcomes I've seen in a case this size. You moved fast when it counted." She wrote back, "We moved fast. Thank you, Daniel." She meant it collectively. She'd learned in those 11 months something about the difference between doing something and having done something. The latter required other people, always. And the pretense of solitary action was both false and isolating in ways she hadn't fully understood before. Helen Carter was promoted to Director of Guest Operations at the Whitmore Park in month 9. It wasn't a consolation. It was what the role required, and Helen was the most qualified person for it. When Natalie told her, Helen's response was characteristically direct. "I don't want it because of the notebook," Helen said. "You're not getting it because of the notebook," Natalie said. "You're getting it because you've been running the operational knowledge of this hotel for 15 years without the title or the pay that went with it. The notebook is a separate matter." Helen looked at her for a moment. "All right," she said. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." Gloria was by that point one of 3 hourly employees who'd agreed to serve on the newly formed Employee Operations Advisory, a small group that met quarterly with Sandra Okafor and one member of the board to review payroll practices, benefit structures, and the anonymous reporting system Natalie had set up. It was not a perfect system. Nothing was. But it was a structure with real people in it who had real reasons to make it work. And that was a different thing from a policy document sitting in a compliance folder that no one read. The board meeting in month 10 was the one Natalie would remember most clearly. Not because of any single dramatic moment, there wasn't one. The drama, the kind with confrontations and revelations, and the satisfying crack of something coming apart, had happened in courtrooms and conference rooms and a sitting room in Westchester months earlier. What happened in month 10's board meeting was quieter than that, and somehow more significant because of its quietness. She presented the annual operational review, not Charles, Natalie. She stood at the head of the table that her grandfather had probably stood at, in the building he'd bought, in the company her family had built across 3 generations, and she walked 12 board members through 12 months of numbers and decisions and changes and where things were going. She stumbled once over a figure in the property management section. She went back, corrected herself, kept going. Nobody made a thing of it. At the end, one of the older board members, a man named Harrison, who had known her grandfather and had been on the board since before Natalie was born, said, "You've got your mother's eye for the structure of things." She hadn't expected it. "Thank you," she said, and then because she meant it and saw no reason not to. "That matters to me." Charles was sitting 3 seats down, and she didn't look at him, but she felt him in her peripheral vision, the particular stillness of a person who is very carefully not showing what they're feeling. After the meeting, in the hallway, he said, "She would have been proud of you." She'd been expecting something like that, and she'd prepared herself to receive it with the composed grace of a person who has her feelings managed. But something about the specific plainness of how he said it, no preamble, no softening, just the fact of it, got past all of that. She stood in the hallway with her folder under her arm and her eyes going wet before she could stop them, and she said, "I know." It wasn't grace exactly, but it was real. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment, and then they both walked toward the elevator because that's what you do. You feel the thing, and then you keep walking because the building needs to be managed and the work needs to be done, and life doesn't pause for the moments when it's heaviest. She had learned that too. The Riverside Drive apartment had been sitting in its closed rooms quiet through all of it. She'd been avoiding a decision about it for months, telling herself there were more pressing things, and that was true. But it was also true that she'd been afraid of what it would mean to make the decision, that whatever she chose would be a permanent statement about something she wasn't sure she'd processed enough to make permanent statements about. She went back in month 12, alone on a Saturday morning with coffee from the place on Broadway and the particular quiet of a weekend morning when the city is running a few degrees slower than usual. She let herself in. The apartment still smelled like closed rooms. The floral ghost was fainter than she remembered, or maybe she'd just gotten used to expecting it, and the anticipation was larger than the thing itself. She walked through it slowly. It was not a larger apartment, 2 bedrooms, a living room with windows that caught the afternoon but not the morning, a kitchen her mother had once described as functional, which was the diplomatic word for small. The furniture was still her mother's, covered with the sheets Mrs. Yuen had put on when the estate was settled, and Natalie had said she needed some time to decide. Some time had turned out to be 3 years, and then a divorce, and then an 11-month investigation. She sat on the couch under one of the sheets without pulling it off, just sat on the covered surface, in the quiet, with her coffee. She thought about her mother in this apartment, the way Margaret Whitmore had moved through rooms, not quickly, not with the focused purpose she'd brought to the office, but with the particular ease of a person in a space that was theirs. She'd known where everything was without looking. She'd kept records in a cardboard box in the closet behind winter coats, and those records had ended up being the first thread Natalie pulled. A woman who'd been dead for 3 years had helped save her daughter's inheritance. Natalie hadn't let herself say that out loud before. It felt too much like the kind of meaningful narrative that real life didn't actually deliver, too neat and purposeful. But sitting in the quiet of the apartment with the covered furniture and the faint ghost of a perfume she'd never managed to identify, it was simply true, and she let herself acknowledge it. She was going to move in, not immediately. There was work to be done on the apartment, practical work, painting and updating a kitchen that had been functional in her mother's time and was more dated now, bringing the place from preserved to actually lived in. But she was going to do it, and after it was done, she was going to bring her books and her clothes and the particular few objects she'd been carrying from place to place since Patricia's spare bedroom, and she was going to live in her mother's apartment on Riverside Drive. She wasn't entirely sure what that meant about grief or memory or continuity. She suspected she was going to find out gradually, the way you find out most things that matter. Not in a single revelation, but in the slow accumulation of mornings in a particular kitchen and evenings at a particular window. That was okay. She pulled the sheet off the couch while she was there, because it seemed like a start. 3 weeks later, she hired a contractor and gave him a list that was specific but not extravagant. The kitchen got new appliances and the cabinet doors that had always hung slightly crooked got fixed. The bathroom that her mother had intended to renovate and never gotten to was finally renovated. The floors were refinished, the walls were painted a color that was not the color her mother would have chosen, but was the color Natalie chose, because it was going to be Natalie's apartment, and that distinction mattered. She moved in on a Saturday in April, which was 13 months after the courthouse. Patricia helped her carry boxes. Patricia was the kind of person who showed up for the box-carrying portion of a life transition without being asked, which Natalie had known for 20 years but appreciated newly every time. They ordered Thai food and ate it sitting on the floor of the living room because the furniture delivery wasn't until Tuesday, and Patricia talked about the renovation project she was running in her own apartment, and Natalie talked about the Q2 projections for the hotel division, and neither of them said anything particularly significant, and it was one of the best evenings Natalie had had in longer than she could easily calculate. After Patricia left, Natalie sat in the empty living room in the dark, not in distress, just sitting. The apartment sounded different from the Westchester house. The city sounds were there, filtered through the Riverside Drive trees, the ambient hum of the world going about its business a few floors below. The refrigerator in the kitchen made a sound she'd need to get used to. The floor near the window had a spot where the refinishing had gone slightly uneven and caught the light in a specific way she'd probably stopped noticing in a month. She thought about the last 13 months, not in the comprehensive way, not a structured accounting, just the images and moments that surfaced when she let her mind move without directing it. The courthouse steps, the box in the closet, Rachel's voice at 7 in the morning making calls, Daniel's legal pad covered in notes, Helen's notebook, Gloria saying okay, her father's hand on her shoulder in the hallway, the board meeting, the vendor review on a Tuesday in March. She thought about what she'd been, at the beginning of all of it, not naive exactly, but trusting in ways she hadn't examined, and unable to see what was in front of her because she'd organized her world around a belief that the person she'd chosen to build it with was choosing her back in the same way. That belief had been wrong, but the person she'd been when she held it, the woman who'd wanted to trust people, who'd opened her family's company to people who needed chances, who'd worked to make everyone feel welcomed and included, that wasn't the weakness. That was the part worth keeping. Ethan had taken that openness and used it for something cynical. That said something true about him. It said something, but not everything, about her. What she'd done in the 13 months since was not become harder. She'd been afraid at the beginning that the only way to protect herself from what had happened was to become the kind of person who didn't let people in, who held everything at arm's length, who ran the company from behind the glass of careful professional distance. She'd seen that version of herself as a possibility and felt something close to grief about it. But that wasn't what happened. What happened was that she'd gotten more specific about who she let in and why, and she'd built structures that didn't require the people inside them to simply trust that everything was fine. Structures with oversight and anonymous reporting lines and quarterly reviews and real people in the room whose job it was to ask questions. You could be a person who believed in people and also a person who built systems that didn't require everyone to be trustworthy all the time, because people weren't always trustworthy all the time. And pretending otherwise was not generosity, it was just the abdication of responsibility dressed up as warmth. Her mother had known that. She'd kept the records. Natalie was learning to keep the records. She sat in the dark living room of the Riverside Drive apartment and felt the specific strange weight of being 39 years old and starting over in a place that was simultaneously new and deeply familiar, and understood that starting over wasn't failure. It was just what happened sometimes when you'd been building in the wrong direction for long enough. The wrong direction hadn't been the marriage, exactly. It had been the slow decisions before and inside the marriage where she'd chosen comfort over attention, ease over clarity, the good feeling of things seeming fine over the harder work of knowing whether they were. She wasn't going to be perfect at the harder work. She already wasn't perfect at it. But she was doing it, and she was going to keep doing it, and that was a different foundation than the one she'd been standing on 13 months ago. That was something she could build on. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. The distant traffic and the trees and the ambient hum of millions of people living their lives in the particular concentrated proximity that Manhattan required of everyone who chose it. She'd chosen it 20 years ago, and she was still choosing it every morning she woke up in it. She got up off the floor, found a blanket in one of the boxes Patricia had helped her stack against the wall, and lay down on the couch that she'd uncovered 3 weeks ago in this room. The refrigerator made its sound. The floor near the window caught whatever light was coming in from the street. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. A neighbor she didn't know yet, living their own life in their own set of rooms, going about their own unknowable business. She pulled the blanket up. There were things she didn't have yet that she'd had before. The settled feeling of a life with its pieces in their places, the particular ease of knowing what the next year looked like. She didn't know what the next year looked like. She had projections and plans, and a company she was learning to run in a way that was hers, and an apartment she was learning to inhabit, and a grief about her mother that was still unfinished and probably always would be, and a story about her marriage that she was still inside the process of understanding. None of that was resolved. That was just true. But she was in her mother's apartment on Riverside Drive, with the door locked and the blanket pulled up, and the city doing what it did outside the window, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be. That, for now, was enough. Not everything. Not the complete and satisfying arrival at a destination she could point to and say, "This is where it ended." Life didn't end at the places you pointed to. It kept going past them, into the ordinary, unmapped territory of what came next. But enough. The kind of enough that is actually sufficient. Not the settling for less kind, not the making do kind, but the specific, solid, real weight kind that you feel in your body when you've stopped running from something and started moving towards something else. And the ground under your feet is ground you chose. She closed her eyes. Outside, the city went on. And inside the apartment on Riverside Drive, in the quiet of a Saturday night in April, Natalie